Today begins an 8-lecture series of undertold stories of the American Revolution. And if you have ever had David Jones as an instructor, then I don't need to tell you how effective he is in the classroom. So I won't take any more of his time. We'll go ahead and get started with David and
just waiting the last one's in here. Well, welcome. You ready to do some history? All right. As they said in the old Lone Ranger show, let's return to those thrilling days of yesteryear. We're going to talk about, over this week and next week, kind of the foundations, the beginnings of the Revolution. And then we're going to go on to talk about several different stories that occur. So we'll look at privateers and pirates who helped in the Revolution. We'll look at some women who were heroic actions in the Revolution. We'll look at the naval aspects. So we'll do a variety of different things. The things that I said in the catalog, kind of the undertold stories, things that many of you may not have heard about or didn't get enough attention in history. And what we're starting with today is acts of rebellion before the Boston Tea Party. We all know about the Boston Tea Party, December 16, 1773, where a lot of people think that's where the rebellion really got underway. But there were really a lot of things that took place some years before that that kind of gave the impetus to those who were engaged in the Tea Party to do what they did. So that's what we're going to talk about today, kind of the background of some of those things. Start by thinking about the economic conditions at the time, because in a large way, the rebellion was really around many things that had to do with economics. You may be familiar with the idea of the triangle trade. This is trade from North America to Europe to Africa in a roundabout way. America was really founded for economic reasons. We often think about the Puritans and the Pilgrims as being the first, and they came for religious reasons. But before that came the folks in Virginia who came really for economic reasons. And they were very disappointed that the streets were not, in fact, paved with gold. In fact, there were no streets. They came really unprepared to engage in any real work. They just thought they were going to pick up money off the street and send it back to England. But they had to make a living when they got here, so they started doing things with what they had available. And it's raw materials, basically, that are going back to England. So we've got things like well oil, furs, rye, silk, indigo, tobacco in Virginia. We often also need to think about the Caribbean as being a part of this, but this was among the earliest places that were founded by the British and the most profitable, the most economical drivers of the North American economy. So they were sending sugar and molasses back to in Africa. They were receiving some of these goods, the manufactured goods, as well as North America receiving these manufacturing goods. And Africa, of course, was supplying some materials to England, but to North America, they were supplying captive men, women, and children who've been enslaved. So they're going to the Caribbean first. Some find their way into North America. So this is the so-called Middle Passage, most going into the Caribbean. From the Caribbean then comes slaves, comes sugar, molasses, and other kinds of materials in here. So this is the nature of the trade that's going on, all to benefit Britain. So Britain has a series of navigation acts. So these are the things that they put into place to administer this trade that's going on. This is during the time of pre-laissez-faire. This is a time of mercantilism. That is, we do things that benefit the home country. So imports either had to be bought from Britain or resold by British merchants in some way. So America was not allowed to make things that they were going to export. They're an import market, an export market for Britain. They import things to America. So this rubbed many ambitious Americans the wrong way, is that they're not getting a chance to do the manufacturing things and being brokers where the real money is. So there's not a lot of money in the raw material. So this is kind of one irritant to them. In 1733, because of problems with France undercutting the molasses market, what's molasses used for? Rum. Making rum, exactly. And the North America had become the rum producers, and particularly in some of the northern colonies. So this act in 1733 puts a 6-pence tax per gallon on molasses that comes in from non-British places. In other words, they're trying to cut out the French undercutting them here. This, of course, greatly impacts the rum distillers who are in the Northeast. So this really cuts into their profits. They can't get low-cost materials anymore. So what happens in these kinds of things of prohibition, as it were, we get bootleggers, we get smugglers. So smuggling is really prospering during this time. Also, it's a period of relative lax enforcement. Although they put the laws on the book, they didn't put any teeth in it in terms of reinforcement. Rhode Island has become a center for the distilling industry. There are 22 distilleries in Newport alone. Newport's a town of a couple of thousand people, but it's got 22 distilleries. So they're a big importer of molasses, exporter of rum. So this is having an effect on them, and they become very good at the game of smuggling, getting things in. This is a period that we later called the salutary or benign neglect, that Britain is really letting things go their own course without a lot of interference. This is kind of in exchange for something, in exchange for the loyalty of the colonists and for the colonists making a contribution to the economic well-being of the mother country. Okay. So there's kind of an implicit exchange here about what's going on here. But as a result of this laxness of enforcement and following the laws, the colonies develop a high level of autonomy. They really become, in ways, independent. They're making their own laws. They're making their own taxes to govern the colonies, each independently, all 13 of them here. So there's this feeling that we don't so much need the mother country. We're doing things on our own. We have the French and Indian War from 1754, when George Washington started it, until 1763, when it ended. This gave Britain a heightened level of confidence in their military. They were now the most powerful sea power and a significant land power as well. But they also had a need to pay for this military might they had. They've left behind in the colonies in North America some 1,500 officers and several thousand troops. Now, these officers, they're simply kind of hanging on so they can draw a paycheck. They're not needed really militarily, but Britain has to raise the money to pay for them in here. So they need the revenue to pay for keeping troops in America. So they say, you know, we protected you from the French and the Indians during the war. We've got them here now. You need to pay for them. So they started doing things. And also they're feeling that they need to have a greater control of the affairs of the colony. This autonomy of the colonies is starting to niggle at those who want power, and they're looking at how do we increase the control of colonial affairs, kind of so we can squeeze more money out as well. The Molasses Act expired 30 years after its inception in 1763, and it was replaced in 1764 with the Sugar Act, so essentially doing similar things. It's also known as the American Revenue Act, to give you an idea about what they thought about its purpose. But it cut the tax in half and encouraged payment then of the tax. In other words, so one way of doing it is to cut out the smuggling because it's cheaper to just pay the tax than to engage in the smuggling activity. And enforcement's increased. So they're starting putting some of the funds that they gain to enforce the laws. And many of these we'll see are often very high-handed in their enforcement activities. In July of 1764, the ship St. John has been the revenue cutter of the day. It's going around collecting customs on ships. It's stopping ships, taking cargo off the ships. Often simply, instead of the cargo that's supposed to be taxed, they're also taking off livestock. They're taking off cows and pigs and grain, other things in here that are not part of that. Because they're not being funded the way that they should be, so they're just taking it. So as you might expect, this angers the locals. So they outfit a ship that they're going to send out and confront the St. John with until the HMS Squirrel shows up. Now, the Squirrel is a much bigger ship. It's a 20-gun ship. It's not quite a ship of the line, but it's more significant than anything that's been around before versus the 8-gun St. John. So they lay off. But what they do instead is go out to a small fort that doesn't have much garrison, just a few sentries around it, on Goat Island and take over that. So this is Newport back in the day. So we see all the docks that are there. And so Goat Island is just off of here to protect the docks. So they go over and take that out. And Governor Hopkins, Stephen Hopkins, orders the guns that they've seized there to fire on the St. John. So they got an 18-pound cannon there, and they fire 13 shots out at St. John. Now, there's some debate on whether he actually meant to hit the ship or just warn it off. But St. John's couldn't put up with being fired at by land surface. So it quickly escaped out and got out of reach. But about that time, the Squirrel comes back, the 20-gun ship. It's getting ready to pound the Fort George on Goat Island. So the colonists there abandoned that and let it go. But to some, this is the first shots that are fired in resistance to British authority. So it's from this date that some would say that the path of revolution, that first step was taken here. But the action here followed what we'll see is kind of a general pattern. The British do something abusive. There's a public protest, a rally in the streets or whatever that brings it to attention. There's a letter, a petition, or something that goes to higher authority to say, don't do this. Here's our complaint. And then the final step is resort to violence. And often we see the leading members of the community who are engaged in these acts of violence, like taking the fort and firing at St. John. So this is kind of a familiar pattern that we'll see over and over again. Now, the reaction to these things really got kicked off with Governor Stephen Hopkins publishing something called the Rights of the Colonies Examined. And in this document, he says, the liberty is the greatest blessing that men enjoy, and slavery the heaviest curse that human nature is capable of. Now, we think back today, this is kind of ironic about these guys talking about enslavement and how bad that was, because what they pictured was the actions that Britain was taking was to enslave Americans, while at the same time, of course, they are enslaving Africans for their own economic purposes. But so there's kind of this two-mindset thing here. The Britain is trying to enslave us. That's bad. We're enslaving Africans. That's not a big deal. But in the document, he presented a very clear and logical view about the relationship between the colonies and the mother country. And there's kind of this unspoken assumption about what we should expect in this relationship with Britain. And it's that they protect They provide the framework under which we operate, and we all cooperate and get along. So they're starting to see a violation of these basic assumptions in the way that Britain is acting toward America. And this is very disturbing. So they see the violation here. And they particularly, Hopkins particularly calls attention to, and maybe one of the first to talk about the idea of taxation without representation. So one of the basic assumptions that the colonists, the Americans, as we'll call them later, would be that we don't have representatives in Parliament who are acting for us. Therefore, we should act for ourselves. We're the ones who know what our needs are, and we're the ones who should be taxing ourselves, not over there without representation. So this idea starts getting kicked off at this point. Now, this gets widely circulated around all the colonies, so that it starts becoming a concern across the 13 colonies at the time. Actually, there are 15 colonies at this point, because West and East Florida became part of the British Empire after the French and Indian War, but most of them spoke Spanish or something, so they never got very involved in what was going on with the rebellion, although they were invited to some of the things that were engaged in. The next kind of thing that the British do is the Stamp Act. This goes into effect in November of 1765. And it was known for a while it was coming, because it was passed in March, and there's a lot of discussion of it. The news between Britain and America is pretty regular, so it doesn't take more than about 5 or 6 weeks generally to get news. So there's news about what's going on in Parliament. This is the really first direct tax. Now, most of the taxes have been import, export kinds of taxes, excise taxes. But this is the first thing that everybody's going to be effective of for each action that they take. It requires stamps to be put on almost all kind of documents. Anything with paper, it's got to have a stamp. Playing cards, wills, birth certificates, anything, it's got to have a stamp. You got to pay money in order to do it. We have now a Stamp Act Congress. There's so much anger about this going on that communication goes back and forth among the colonies, and many of them get together. Now, Georgia, North Carolina, New Hampshire, and Virginia don't attend. Georgia's too far and is too young to really start thinking about these things at this point. And Virginia was above it all. They want to go their own way with everything in here. But they got together. They expressed first, we're loyal to the crown. This is not about anything disloyal. We respect and give the supremacy of Parliament. But only elected representatives can levy taxes. Parliament has levied this taxes. It's not right. So this is the conclusion out here. So they petitioned to the House of Lords, the House of Commons, and they don't even read this stuff. They just reject it out of hand. They hear what it is, and they don't pay any attention to it. But the message got through that there's resistance to this. It laid the groundwork for widespread communication among the colonies. So we'll see this come up later. But this was kind of the first effort that one colony has tried to contact another and start seeing some joint working together about doing things. And will eventually lead in 1774 to the First Continental Congress. But the Stamp Act was repealed in 1766. So what have we learned from this? If we protest loudly enough, they'll repeal the act. So, it's kind of like, when you train your dog, you think you're rewarding it for one thing, it sees another thing and starts training you. So this may be what happened here. But we're still going to have a variety of different incidences coming up here. In the summer of 1765, 28-gun frigate. So this is much larger than the Squirrel. This starts coming in. They cover reinforcements, enforcement of the customs laws. The Maidstone comes in and starts impressing sailors. Now, Britain was constantly having a shortage of people willing to serve on the ships. And it's not surprising because conditions on the ships were brutal. They got whipped for the smallest thing in there. So nobody wanted to volunteer. So they passed laws that made it possible for the Navy to say, I need men, and go get them. You know, there's the stories about the pirate house here and the tunnel that goes under it out to the river, and you know, they were supposed to be taking sailors out to that. So that was impressment in there. So it was perfectly legal as far as the British were concerned. Obviously, it causes problems everywhere. I mean, all of a sudden, you know, if you've got a husband and father of 7 children who gets taken off the streets, what happens to the wife and those 7 children when their main support's gone? Because it takes months to get paid from the Navy back home. They starve, they go to the workhouse. So a lot of problems with impressment. But they started doing this, vessels coming in, fishing boats, whatever. They need sailors. You're a sailor, come with me. So it starts affecting the economy. Ships don't want to go into the harbor there where they're subject to impressment. So they stay away. So we start seeing this. June 4th, Maidstone impressed the entire crew of a brig. So this is going to be 40-ish people or so get impressed. They petitioned the captain to let them go. He refused to release them. An officer from the Maidstone is found wandering the streets. He gets taken up and beaten as a sign. They take a boat. There's a small rowboat that's come in off the Maidstone in to get supplies and things. They take it out, drag it out, and burn it. Custom officer in Providence gets tarred and feathered. So we start seeing a series of minor incidences like this occurring across New England primarily. The British start tightening the screws a little bit. They still need their money. They've repealed the Stamp Act. They've got, you know, still the molasses tax and things like that, but they need more money. So they start putting together a series of acts that are called the Townshend Acts. Charles Townshend was the Chancellor of Exchequer. We would call him the Secretary of the Treasury. Some of these taxes were proposed by an American named Charles Paxson, who was a custom official here, and he says, here's some things in America you could tax that you could get your money. But on a variety of different goods, from glass to lead to paint, paper, tea, all these things are going to have a tax on them. There's a board of customs that are established to collect and to step up the collections to make sure they get done. They wanted to be sure, and they carefully selected these folks that they put into these roles in kind of an anti-corruption mode that you know, they would be more straightforward. And they're not going to turn a blind eye to the things that they've turned a blind eye to in the past. Well, as you might expect, they get a hostile reception. Boston is in particular in an uproar about this. So the officials here call on the Navy to help them out. And they send down a ship, the HMS Romney, to help with the fight, the smuggling that's going on. One of the great documents, and we'll talk more about this next time when we talk about stirring the pot, is John Dickinson publishes a series of 12 letters starting in December of 1767. Letters from a farmer in Pennsylvania, in which he lays out the case against these kinds of things. And it becomes very influential across all the colonies in resisting the Townshend Act in here. And it's ultimately the repeal of the Townshend Act that left a tax on tea that led to the Boston Tea Party. But that's in place now with having, you know, tax on many different common commodities. And the enforcement, as we talked about, has been stepped up. In the spring of 1768, a smuggler And that was kind of a line of business, as you might imagine back then. And, you know, most people thought that was a reputable kind of business, you know, thumbing your nose at the authorities and so forth. So he comes in one day with, he's got his shipment of wine out in his ship. He comes into the port authorities and asks them, how much would it cost me to land my cargo without paying the tax? In other words, he's offering a bribe. Don't pay this. So he figures a bribe is cheaper than paying the tax. And they refuse him. They said, we don't do business that way anymore. Well, okay. So he goes away, takes his ship down to a quiet cove and secretly unloads about 2/3 of his cask of wine. Next day, he comes back to the port authorities and says, I'm here with my cargo to pay the tax. So they go out and see his cargo and give him the tax. But they get a little bit suspicious. Said, why would he only have 1/3 of the ship full when, you know, it's obviously more economical? What's he done with the rest of it? So they decide they want to go collect the rest of it. So they start heading to his house, but he gets tipped off before, you know, while they're gathering a few people to go confront him at his house. And he gathers 400 people who surround his house. So when the officials come there and see all the crowd around protecting them, they kind of quietly walk away. But this is really a sign that the lax days of accepting a bribe and moving on are over. It's going to be much more difficult to deal with this. One of the merchants in Boston, John Hancock, he's inherited a business from his family. And one of his ships comes in, a ship named Lydia, comes into port. The customs officers come aboard, or try to come aboard, and he asks for their warrants. Where are your warrants? Where's your authority to come here and do this inspection? Well, they don't have them. You know, well, this is the way we do business. No, it's not. Where's your warrant? You've got to have an authorization to come here. So they were kindly asked to leave in there. But let's kind of put their backs up in the customs office, and Hancock is on the radar now. And he's start to be looked at as, here's a guy that if we could catch him doing something, he's popular, he's rich, it would set an example. So they're kind of looking for a way of making an example out of him. Well, we mentioned the Romney. It's a big ship. It's a fourth-rate ship, 50 guns. So it's a ship of the line, they would have called it. It came into Boston in May of 1768. And immediately Captain John Corner starts going out recruiting. That is, impressing people here. The locals fight back. They go attack the gangs that are coming in to impress people. So, but the effect that they have is to ruin business. So now even honest ships, as well as the smugglers, don't want to come in and risk impressment. So business suffers as a result. But the Romney also shows a difference in the British approach. It's no longer just protection and collecting customs, it's really policing. It's a firm enforcement and policing role here. Well, Hancock's got a ship named the Liberty that came into port with a cargo of Madeira wine. This is some of the best wine of the era in here. He comes in, duly the customs officials come out. He asks for their warrant. Ha! We got you this time. We've got our warrants. So show the warrants. They come on to do their inspection. They find the ship's about 25% full of the Madeira wine. Pays his tax and they go off. But about a month later, things start to change. Back in the customs office, they're thinking about the case of Daniel Malcolm back, you know, a few weeks ago that came in and tried to hide his cargo, they think. So we think that Hancock is doing the same thing. You know, where's the other 75% of his cargo that should be here? And the guy who had gone out to inspect, now a fellow named Thomas Kirk, kind of changes his story about what happens and says, well, when I was out there, they offered me a bribe to let them get away with, hiding 75% of what they're bringing in. And when I refused, they locked me up in the hole and wouldn't let me go until I promised not to charge them for the rest of the wine. So he's completely changed the story about what happened a month earlier. So the customs officials are now after Hancock for this thing. So our port collector and the controller, fellows named Harrison and Hollowell, called on Romney to come in to help. So Romney sends the ship in, they send in the crew. There's a scuffle that breaks out. The crew of the Romney, being trained sailors and fighters, kind of calm things down and clear the ship out. But Harrison and Hollowell don't escape unscathed. They get a little bruised and battered in the confrontation there. But the Liberty is seized, is taken out with the Romney, so it's there under the protection of the 50 guns, so that nobody's going to come take it out there. But a crowd grows of 3,000 people who start going around the town looking for these two guys, for Harrison and Hollowell in there. They can't find them, so they go to their house. They break the windows in the house. They take a pleasure boat, drag it out of the water, bring it up into town to the Liberty Tree where they set it on fire. So they have a great bonfire there. The commissioners and the two port authorities head out to the Romney for protection in here. Well, they're not about to let Hancock get away with this, so suits are brought against him for smuggling and for having illegal goods, contraband goods on the ship. So they take the ship away from him. He tries to negotiate it back. They refuse any kinds of offer for it. He gets a young attorney in Boston named John Adams to defend him, and he does a good job of defending him, and he gets off the smuggling charge simply because the only evidence they had was this guy who changed his story, and that's not very credible, so he gets off. But this really lays the foundation for much more action to come. The British, to kind of flaunt what they're doing here, takes the Liberty, they convert it into a small gunship to use as an enforcement ship in Rhode Island. So now not only is it taken from Hancock, it's now being used to enforce what they're doing. Well, Boston is up in arms about all this. So the British decide, because of what's going on here, that they need to send troops in to keep the peace. This was ultimately broken with the Boston Massacre. So in March of 1770, we've got that. And next week we'll talk about that and its effect. But this is kind of the series of events that led to those troops being in Boston that led to that. So we see across the colonies in Massachusetts, in Boston, in Rhode Island, similar things are happening up and down the Northeast coast, to a lesser extent in other places. You know, the British are also enforcing these things in Virginia and North Carolina, South Carolina, but because they're not as merchandise oriented and not as engaged in the molasses smuggling and the wine smuggling business that the Northeast is, we see it primarily playing out in the Northeast. Now we come to maybe the most famous of the affairs, the Gaspee. Now this is originally a small ship, a single-masted sloop, probably built in Canada, and it's named Gaspee for the Gaspee Peninsula in New Brunswick. Purchased by the British in New York and converted into a revenue and customs ship. It gets reconverted a little bit later into a two-masted schooner, so they've kind of expanded it out and added some more things to it. And put some guns on it. So now it's in revenue service. And he comes, after serving in Virginia and Delaware for a while, comes into Newport in February of 1772, commanded by Lieutenant William Duddingston. He comes in and meets with Governor Joseph Wanton. And Wanton is not totally enthusiastic in his meeting with him. He pledges cooperation, blah, blah, blah. But, you know, the colony is very upset with these ships coming in, doing the things that they're doing, harassing them, taking goods illegally, and so forth. So he's not promising a lot of cooperation. But Duddingston immediately starts out doing his patrols and customs enforcement. The Gaspee stopped a ship called the Fortune and sent her to Boston. Now, this is a big deal. The charter for most of the Crown chartered colonies calls for any legal action to be taken within the colony. So here they've taken a ship out of Rhode Island, sent it to Boston in here. So this is kind of another thorn that prickles in the colony here. So they're outraged by this action. In March, Governor Wanton demanded that Duddingston produce me your commission. So there's a copy of the letter that he sent out, telling him the reasons why he needs to see exactly what it is you're supposed to be doing. Are you really following your orders, or have you exceeded your orders with this? Well, Duddingston sends back a very rude reply. He refuses to do this. He won't get off the ship. He won't even acknowledge Wanton's authority to ask for this in any way. Next step, we write letters to higher authority, both the Vice Admiralty in New York and to London. They get no help from these. So tensions are continuing to build here. Remember, this is a year and a half after the Boston Massacre, so this is a time that people are still very angry about the British and things that are going on here. In June of 1772, Captain Benjamin Lindsay comes in with his cargo. He stops at Newport. He clears the customs there as he should. And he and his ship, the Hannah, start up Narragansett Bay, going up to Providence. They've got all the appropriate things. They think they're good, but they're speeding along. They're going full out as fast as they can. And so when Duddingston sees them, he thinks, something's going on here. There's no reason for them to be going this fast unless they're trying to pull the wool over our eyes about something. So he attempted to stop Hannah. Again, stories vary about whether he just fired a shot to make noise to make them stop or fired a shot across the bow. But at any rate, he makes some attempt. Lindsay completely ignores him. He keeps sailing. Lindsay doesn't lower his flag. The custom usually would be if you see a British ship, you lower your flag to kind of say hi and raise your flag back up and go on. He didn't even do that. He's just speeding on. Well, Duddingston gave orders to chase Hannah. Now, as you might expect, Duddingston has just arrived in the area. He's not real familiar with the ins and outs, the shoals, sandbars, and things like this. He's supposed to have an experienced pilot on, but he's sick that day, so he's got a substitute who doesn't know much about the area. So Lindsay, in his way, is taking off, and he's very familiar with a certain place here where it's very shallow and very tricky. So if we look at it today, it's now called Gaspee Point. It was called, because of what happened here. Back in the day, it was called the Namquid Point. But there's some tricky grounds around there. So Lindsay cuts close to where it is and goes on his way. He's got a little smaller ship, so he can cut in closer. But Gaspee runs aground, gets stuck fast. Tide's going out, so they can't get the ship off until the next high tide, which is going to be about 12 hours away. So here is the Gaspee stuck here on the sandbar. He sends the crew out, and some of the crew members out in a small boat to get some help, maybe find somebody that can help tow them off. The Hannes crew cheers as they go by. Some reports suggest they may have mooned them as well as cheering them as they go by. Believe that if you want. But as Lindsay goes on, he thinks, how can I take advantage of this situation of a ship that we all hate stuck on a sandbar out here? So he goes immediately to John Brown. Well, who's John Brown? He's not Harper's Ferry John Brown. This is, 87 years, in fact, before John Brown invades. So a different John Brown. But he's a successful sea merchant. He's from a family of several brothers, and his father founded the business. They're all quite successful. They've been engaged. They were among the founders and contributors to the founding of the College of Rhode Island. In fact, John becomes the treasurer. His brother Nicholas Jr. becomes the chancellor, gives a bunch of money to the university, and they call the university after him after that, Brown University. But John's a larger-than-life figure. He's over 6 feet tall. He's 300-plus pounds. He's the big man about town here. But he wants to go his own way, so he leaves his brother's business, starts his own, becomes very successful of trading, shipbuilding, privateering, that is kind of a licensed pilot, and distilling. Engaged a little bit in the slave trade. His brothers had also. There's a great excuse me on Brown University's website that you can read about. They're apologizing for their founders here. John was never very successful with it, so he didn't engage in it very long. But he's the Hardy Bonville, the man about town. Everybody in town knows him in here. Involved in other philanthropic projects in addition to University of Rhode Island. Builds the first Baptist church in America. So engaged in a variety of different things. And he's among those who are really complaining about what the Gaspee is out here doing, harassing people, stopping them for smuggling and so forth, and the excesses, the rudeness of Duddington and so forth. He's probably, we don't know for sure, but probably active in the Sons of Liberty movement that got started at the time. Well, Lindsay found Brown in Sabines Tavern. We really don't have a good picture of that, but this may be it, or a building something like this. And this is where all the business is done. America didn't have a lot of coffee houses like they did in London. The business and the gathering point is in taverns. Well, Brown immediately comes to the conclusion, let's destroy this. We've got to destroy the Gaspee, not Hannah. How did that get in there? So he recruited a 12-year-old drummer boy to go out and holler out beats. So this is where the expression to drum up business come from. They used to literally go out with like a drummer boy drumming up and saying, come to the sale at Jones's hardware store or whatever. So he goes out telling people to come to the tavern. The Gaspee's stuck. We want to do something about this. So he sent out words he's got a lot of captains. Brown is in the shipping business, so he's got quite a few captains with experience. So he calls them in, most notably Abraham Whipple, and we'll get to his story in a moment. But he had Whipple gather up a bunch of longboats and prepare them to go out on an adventure. He designated as a captain to each of the boats, somewhere between 10 and 12 boats perhaps he gets there. Well, Abraham Whipple, now this is not to be confused with the anti-squeezing the Charmin Whipple. This is a totally different guy. And totally different character and attitude as well. He was born in Providence, went to sea as a young boy. Some think he may have been as young as 10 or 11 when he goes out to sea. Works his way up to, by the time of the French and Indian War beginning in the mid 1750s, he's got his own ship. He's named the captain of the Providence in 1758 and given a letter of marque. Now, a letter of marque is what you needed to go out and raid other ships and not be accused of being a pirate. So this is a document essentially that legalizes you to be a pirate if you're doing the work against your enemy. So here the French are the enemy, so he goes down the Caribbean to harass the French. Has an immediate success of retaking a ship that had a British privateer that had been taken by the French, so he takes it back. So he's immediately successful. Returns to Providence in late 1758. Then he's given the command of a bigger ship, the Gamecock, that's owned by 5 of the most prominent merchants in Rhode Island. And now he becomes really a master privateer. Over the next 2 years, his reputation grows. He becomes a fearful name on the high seas out here. One report says that he captured in a 6-month period 23 French ships. So he is he's busy doing these things. So he is a person to be reckoned with in this situation. One of the interesting stories about him is that he survived a severe gale, a minor hurricane in the Caribbean. But when coming out of it, the French were on his tail, chasing him down with a much larger ship. They were going to outrun him in here. So he throws half his cannons overboard to lighten the ship and start moving. But this means now he's not very well protected. So he has to come up with some subterfuge in there. So he makes some fake cannons. And so for every place that they've thrown one over, he's got, something here that makes it look like a cannon. And he marches his men around several times in different uniforms, so it looks like he's got 2 or 3 times the number of people that he has on the ship. And the French flag off. They said they're not going to do it. So by the mid-1860s, the period where we're talking about now or onward, he's really getting involved in the politics of Rhode Island and the colonies in here. So he's going to lead. Brown is kind of in charge of the overall expedition, but Whipple is in charge of all the boats and the activities here. So he's going to be the main man in the raid. So he takes about 80 men, as we're saying, somewhere between 10 and 12 of these longboats go out to where the Gaspee is stuck on the sandbar. Now, they want to sneak up on them, so they muffle the oarlocks and put material on the oars so that they're quiet. And they draw up within about 50 or 60 yards of the Gaspee before they're spotted. The watch hauls out to hail them, sends somebody down to wake up Lieutenant Duddingston, because it's about midnight, so most of the crew is asleep. Duddingston comes running up with a sword in hand, ready to go, and hollers out, "Who comes there?" Well, Whipple, being in the lead boat here, stands up and hollers out, "I am the sheriff of Kent County. I've come to apprehend you. Expletive deleted, surrender. Expletive deleted, you." About that time, somebody, not clear, there are a couple of 2 or 3 people who kind of claimed this, but somebody shot and it hit Duddingston in the thigh. He crumples over. Somebody hollers out, "I've killed the rascal." The crew starts, he's only wounded, but the crew starts taking him down below. But in all the confusion about what's going on from the gunshot and taking him below, the sailors from the longboat start running up on the ship. They start ransacking the ship, they run down. And somebody, though, stops to give first aid to Duddingston. So they've got somebody with some medical training gives first aid to him. Meanwhile, the rest of the crew is ransacking Duddingston's quarters. But they get a few things off the ship. They really don't want to steal a lot of stuff. It's more taking a few souvenirs. But run off the ship. Get the crew off. They take the crew, get them into their longboats, and set fire to the ship. Now, they're rowing like mad because they know there's a store of gunpowder on the ship. And they get away a little ways, and the ship explodes. Blown to smithereens. So there's not a lot left of it to find. So they get back, disperse, quietly go home, go to bed, act as if nothing has happened. Well, of course, there's going to be a reaction. The governor charged the civil and military officers to exert themselves with the utmost vigilance to discover and apprehend the persons guilty of the aforesaid atrocious crime, that they may be brought to condign punishment, that is, appropriate punishment. And he offered a £100 reward. You remember, he wasn't all this enthusiastic about Duddington to begin with. So there's not a lot of expenditure of energy to go out and try to find the miscreants here. Of course, everybody knows who did it. Everybody watched them planted in the tavern and so forth. The newspapers printed up similar stories kind of describing the basic things, putting his proclamation about wanting to capture these miscreants. Papers throughout New England, in fact, across all the colonies, started reprinting the details of this story. But of course, Whipple and the other guys here are a little bit anxious about what's going to happen. Are the British authorities really going to find them and start coming down on them? Well, the reaction in Britain didn't take long to happen. In less than a month, the word has gotten to Britain about what happened. Lord Hillsborough, who's Secretary for the Colonies, informed the officials in Rhode Island that exert themselves most actively to discover the offenders. Now, he's for real. He wants them caught. He's angry about this. They declare that the burning of the Gaspee is a treasonous offense. You've levied war. It's high treason. So the stakes are going up. A couple of weeks later, King George gets involved in it, denounces the insurgents, offers. Story's different a little bit. So one version says that he offers £1,000 for the two ringleaders, as if they knew who the two ringleaders were, and £500 for any of the others who are caught, and strongly warned against any other things of this nature. Now, Hillsborough gets replaced by Lord Dartmouth in this period. It was his father that the college was named for. But now he's the head of American Affairs, and he establishes a commission. We're going to put together a group of people to go investigate. We're going to get to the bottom of what's going on here. Now, Isaac Hopkins is a colleague of Whipple. He's also worked for Hopkins and Brown. And he sends a letter that he intends for Whipple to get in Dominica. And it says the commission's purpose was to take up and send home to England for trial all those that were concerned with the burning of the schooner Gaspee. Now, there's something very significant in what he's telling Whipple here. To take up and send home to England. Now, this is a big change. Remember that one ship they got outraged about sending the Fortune to Boston. Now they're talking about taking the so-called criminals to England for trial. This would be a first. So this is serious business and something very unusual. Again, trying to show their authority here. He also made some wild claims about 10,000 troops and sailors coming in that were not true. But he concluded, what will be the consequences of this, I cannot tell. So he's kind of warning Whipple, you may not want to come back right away. Well, the commission's appointed, and they finally get together to meet. It takes them from September when they're appointed until January to meet. It consists of the justices from Massachusetts, New York, New Jersey, the judge for the Vice Admiralty, and the Rhode Island governor are all on the commission. Now, public opinion is that this is a pretty biased group. The only one might be on their side is the governor, and after all, so he's still a British official. So they highly criticize this. Now, various witnesses are called. Most of them refuse to appear. The commission doesn't have, I guess, a very strong subpoena power, but many of them, even if they don't appear, write a letter. And we know nothing, is the basic message, except for one person. Now, this is an African-American servant named Aaron Briggs. And in his deposition, he says that he was on one of the longboats that was engaged in the activity. He was asked to sit down next to a wounded sailor and to take care of him. And he later identified him as being Lieutenant Duddington there. So it's a pretty strong case. That he can name names of many of the people whom he saw on those longboats and testify about what went on. But he's got a couple of strikes against him. One is he's black, so he's kind of discounted in his testimony. And also the owners of the farms where he works say he never left the farm. So they swear that he was there. So there's no really credible testimony or evidence against anybody here because you can't really believe this guy. So they could find no one to accuse of the act. So they can't send anybody to trial to England. So they concluded, upon the whole, we are of the opinion that the several matters and things contained in said dispositions do not induce a probable suspicion that persons mentioned herein are guilty of the crime aforesaid. Pretty straightforward language, right? So no, we can't find anybody to blame on this. So we've got a big cover-up that's happened here. But the prospect of being sent to England sends out a general alarm. There's a great deal of concern now about Britain really violating those basic assumptions, this notion of autonomy that we had that we thought we had kind of worked out. Remember, Britain has no written constitution. It's basically a precedence, common law kind of thing, unlike our written constitution. So the assumptions here about what's going on are not matching that they're being violated. In Boston, Samuel Adams publishes something called the Boston Pamphlet, and we'll talk about this in some detail next week. But he complained that Parliament planned to deprive Americans of their natural rights. Now, this becomes a big thing, and we'll talk about kind of the ideas from the Enlightenment that were underneath this. But he warned that in the future you can expect more unjust actions. You can expect more taxation without representation, unjust searches, unjust seizures. This is just the beginning, he's saying. He says these policies that they're engaged in is tyranny. So he's really kind of starting to light the fire under this kind of thinking. We'll talk about that next time. It's called stirring the pot of so fomenting the rebellion here. But growing out of this is committees of correspondence. First within Massachusetts. So these are people who get together in groups to talk about these issues, and they're going to correspond with similar groups in other towns. So we're going to start spreading the word. We're going to start seeing some unity of action here. By the end of the year, it's all across Massachusetts. Soon it's across all the New England colonies. By early 1774, we see it in every state except Pennsylvania in here. So they've got these committees. We had one in Georgia that got started around this time. Well, the legacy from the affair here again, Whipple's family, among others, claimed that the affair was the true beginning of the revolution, not at Lexington and Concord. This is where we really got, this is where the real first shots were fired and whatnot. So everybody wants to be in line to be first. Seems a little overstated because there was no widespread armed rebellion activities as there was after Lexington and Concord. But again, this idea that it started these committees in here, started organizing resistance, become an important thing. So this is the real legacy here. George Washington was aware of the important role here. One of his biographers says that in June of 1774, he went to he spent 3 shillings and 9 pence to see fireworks in celebration of the anniversary of the burning of the Gaspee. So yeah, Virginia took up the idea here. Their legislature, the House of Burgess, had a meeting about this. So it was a well-known thing. Every year now, the village of Patuxent commemorates the act with Gaspee Day's celebration, including the burning of a model ship and effigy of the Gaspee. Well, some final words about what happened here. In the late 1774, Captain James Wallace of the HMS Rose came to Narragansett Bay and became the scourge of the bay, as his predecessors has done. He started going out creating problems. But he wrote a letter to Whipple. It says, "You, Abraham Whipple, on the 10th of June, 1772, burned His Majesty's vessel, the Gaspee, and I will hang you at the yardarm." So, pretty credible threat here from somebody like this. Whipple writes back in reply to Sir James Wallace, "Sir, always catch a man before you hang him." By the way, there's a connection with Savannah here. Wallace and the Rose left Rhode Island in the fall of 1775 to come here, where he married Anne Wright, who was the daughter of Royal Governor James Wright. Later on, the Rose came back again to Savannah and was scuttled in the Savannah River here off of south of Hutchinson Island to prevent the French ships from coming in during the siege of Savannah in October 1779. So it was in part responsible for the failure of the Patriots to retake Savannah from the British during that time. A couple of things to read here. There is a website here that gives you some details on the Liberty affair. Gaspee.org has as much information as you probably ever want about the Gaspee affair. There's got a roll call of all the people who were involved and all the details there. And encountered a couple books, but the better one is probably Burning the Gaspee by Roy Raven. Next week, we're going to kind of look at the fomenting, the beginning of the revolution. But John Adams said of this, the revolution was effected before the war commenced. The revolution was in the minds and hearts of the people. And we're saying there's kind of 2 separate events. There's the revolution in the hearts and minds, and then there was the war that won the independence. But the war of hearts and minds began before the actual war. So that's what we're going to address next week. We'll look at a couple of key players here, Samuel Adams and Thomas Paine. Thank you. Yes, ma'am. There was no loss of life in the Gaspee affair.
What happened to Lieutenant Lieutenant?
Lieutenant Duddington really is kind of lost out of history. No, I mean he what did he do? I mean he was following what he saw as his orders. He's not going to be tried for that. We'll come back to Whipple in several weeks. We're going to look at the privateer's role in the Revolution and the Navy Commodores. So we'll take a look at Whipple again. Have a good week. We'll see you next time.